The very lifeblood of the church is evangelism. Evangelism is the business of teaching the gospel or preaching the gospel to all the world. Jesus charged his disciples to do that, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. In 1 Timothy, the 5th chapter, Paul said that the church is the 3rd chapter, in verse 15, he said, "If I tarry long, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth." The church is the agency that God ordained to use in the preaching of the gospel to the lost. In 1 Thessalonians, the 1st chapter, verse 8 beginning, Paul said that from you, that is the church at Thessalonica, from you sounded out the word of the Lord, not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but everywhere your faith to God were to spread abroad, so that we need not to speak anything. The church at Thessalonica then was busy in sounding out the word of the Lord. In the book of Revelation, the 7 churches of Asia were described as lampstands, that is, dispensers of light, the light of the gospel of Jesus Christ. In the Philippian letter, Paul said in chapter 1, verse 5, that the church at Philippi had fellowship with him in the gospel, seeing to it that he was able to preach it. In the 4th chapter of Philippians, verses 15 and 16, he said, "You Philippians know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church communicated with me concerning giving and receiving, but ye only. For even in Thessalonica you sent once and again to my necessity." In 2 Corinthians 11 and 8, Paul said, "I took wages of other churches to do you service." Now, what do we have here? Well, the church is the pillar and ground of the truth, but the church has a right to support men to go out and preach the gospel. Paul thanked the Philippian church for their work in doing that. And he said, "You sent even once and again, even at Thessalonica." Philippi was a new congregation, hadn't been there long. And as Paul was making his way out of Macedonia, they sent once and again to his necessity. Here you have a matter of the church taking care of supporting those who preach the gospel. 2 Corinthians 11:8 makes the same point. There were a plurality of churches there that helped support them. When the church in Jerusalem heard that Antioch had received the gospel, a church made up of Jews and Gentiles both, they sent Barnabas as far as Antioch that he might come and exhort the brethren and encourage them in the faith. So we have precedent from the Bible for churches sending men to preach. We have precedent for churches sending support to men to enable them to preach the gospel to the lost. Now that sounds simple. But after World War II was over, we had a number of men who came home from the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. And they said, these men were Christians, and they said, we need to do something to these countries that we've helped decimate here with war. We need to send the gospel of peace to these places. And that was a noble thought. Nobody could question the motive of these. And so they began to advocate greater interest in foreign evangelism. Well, that was a good thing, wasn't it? That needed to be done. But out of that zeal that was developed, they developed a program or a plan that brethren utilized that was not good, and it resulted in division taking place among churches of Christ. And that had to do with what was called the sponsoring church. What was that? Well, this was a congregation that would take on a project of work that was greater than it could fund. They didn't have enough money to support it. So how are they going to do that? Well, they're going to collect money from other churches to do that. That's what the Missionary Society did. This was an agency that collected funds from churches everywhere to send men out to preach in different places. Well, as this fervor began to grow among churches, there were several large congregations that decided to become what came to be known as sponsoring churches. The church at Union Avenue in Memphis, Tennessee, for instance, decided that they would take on the evangelizing of Japan. So they said, we'll plan this, and we're going to send men over there, and we want these other churches to help us to do that. And so they began to collect money from churches all around the country to help in the work in Japan. The Broadway Church in Lubbock, Texas said, we want to see to it that the gospel goes to Germany, and we'll sponsor the work in Germany. And so they selected some men and sent over there to preach and collected money from various churches around the country to take care of that. They didn't have the money to fund that, so they became the sponsor. These other churches provided the money, and they said, we'll oversee it. We'll be the sponsor of it. Then the church at Brownfield, Texas said, well, the gospel needs to go to Italy, and we're going to sponsor the work in Italy. So they selected some men and sent them to Italy to preach. And they again collected money from other churches to provide what they were not able to do. Now you say, well, what was wrong with that? Well, there's several things wrong with that. First place, it's not scriptural. That's what's wrong with it. That's the basic thing wrong with it. It doesn't comply with the authority of the scriptures, which we talked about the last hour here. But in 1 Peter 5 that our brother read a while ago, Peter said to the elders of the church, tend the flock of God which is among you. The oversight of elders of a church begins and ends with the local church in which they have been chosen to serve as leaders and shepherds. Tend the flock of God among. Now, what does that include? Well, the elders of a local church, local churches are independent. We don't have a synod or a conference or something of this nature that the denominational churches have. There, where you have a collection of congregations, you have a central organization that orchestrates all of that. Each congregation is independent. It tends to its own business. It raises its own funds. It spends its own funds. It disciplines its own members. It makes decisions and provision for when they will assemble to meet, whether on Sunday sometime, Sunday morning or the afternoon or at night, or a midweek service on Tuesday or Wednesday night, or having gospel meetings and men's training classes and classes for the women and so forth. But this is all under the auspices of the local church. God ordained the local church then to be independent of every other one. Now, that means that they have a right to collect their own funds and spend them, but they don't have a right to take care of tending to any part of the responsibility of other congregations. Now, after that was in the mill, it became very popular for preachers going to other countries to preach, or going to some part of this country where there were very few churches to preach, to get them a sponsoring church, to collect money to help send them to these places. And a lot of brethren thought that was a good thing. And others began to raise questions about the scripturality of this procedure, of what was being done. I was involved in that because I was a young preacher and I had to decide what I was going to do about this issue, where I was going to stand. It was not an easy time. In fact, there were some hard feelings among brethren, and some have misjudged the nature of that and have said that, well, there was wrong on both sides. Well, there were some things said on both sides of that controversy that probably would have been better off not said in the heat of controversy. But there were fundamental issues at stake here. What were they? Well, first of all, the very nature of the church and the organization of it. The only organization God gave the church to use in its work is the local church, overseen by elders. That's the organization God gave for it. And the work that he gave it to do was limited. It was limited to evangelism and edification of the saints and relief under some certain circumstances among the saints. All these were the fundamental responsibilities of local churches. But the sponsoring church destroyed the equality of churches in the sense. It made some churches unequal. the sponsoring church was unequal to the others. In fact, it destroyed the independence of churches. Instead of churches being independent, they became dependent upon other people. And the thing that became the cap on this division as it developed, in 1952 there was begun a program out of Abilene, Texas called the Herald of Truth. It was a radio program initially, later it expanded to television. This program was started by two preachers who first of all had a sponsoring church on a smaller scale in the state of Iowa. And that was James Walter Nichols and James D. Williford. They were ambitious and talented young men. They went to Abilene and they took this idea to the college church in Abilene. And the elders of the college church listened to what they had to say. They decided not to take this on. So then they went to the Fifth and Highland Church in Abilene and asked them if they would take on this project. And they decided to do it. And one of their elders became a traveling elder all over the country to help raise funds for that. When they first began that program, they said in their and I have copies of this, in their published appeals, they said they were able to supply $1 for every $200 that other churches would supply. Now, you know, if I could get somebody to put up $200 for every one I do, I could live on a different scale or a different level than I do right now. How about that? But that was what they said. I attended some of the meetings that were held around the country where some of the representatives of the Herald of Truth would speak. And this became a litmus test among congregations. If you were not willing to help support that, then you were what was called an anti-church. You were against evangelism. Well, nobody was against evangelism. I was involved in it from the time I was 20 years old. I started preaching even earlier than that. But I've been involved in that all of my life. Nobody was against evangelism at all. They said, well, you're against radio preaching. No, nobody. I had a radio program. I was preaching the gospel on it. Nobody was opposed to preaching on the radio. Later on television, nobody was opposed to preaching on television. That was not an issue at all. But this sponsoring church became it became a wedge between churches. And the congregations that were not willing to line up and to contribute to it were considered off-brand. They're just different. They were so-called anti-churches. And I think about Brother Robert Turner one time told me that down in San Antonio, Texas, the church down there suffered a great division over this principle as well as some others. He said he had a brother to come into his office one day all disturbed, and he said, Brother Turner, are you anti? And Brother Turner didn't answer him. He just looked at him, and the fellow said, I said, are you anti? He didn't say a word. Finally he said, you hard of hearing? Are you anti? And Robert said, well, I was waiting for you to finish your sentence. Am I anti what? Anti just means against. Anti. If you're anti something, you're against it. And I tell you right now, if you want to be a faithful Christian, there are a whole lot of things you need to be against. You need to be an anti about that. Well, I'm opposed to anything that's not authorized in the Word of God. You get the church involved in doing something that God doesn't authorize it to do through the auspices of something that's greater than what a local church is able to accomplish. Yes, I'm against that, and I'm not ashamed of that at all. But that became a dividing wedge. Now, there were other issues that came along with that. The churches that supported this project or these ideas also were involved in the church support of various organizations such as colleges and orphan homes, and we'll discuss that this afternoon. So I'll not go into that now. But as things heated up in some of the periodicals that brethren were publishing, there were two sentiments. There was obviously two mindsets at work among brethren. And it was inevitable that they would not continue together. They could not long, and they did not. There were developed debates that took place. Some brethren had debates on this. I attended the very first one that was conducted in Indianapolis between Charles A. Holt and W.L. Toddy. I attended another debate that was held in Abilene, Texas, on the same issue, where one of the preachers of the Herald of Truth was involved in that debate, Brother E.R. Harper. When I was a young preacher, I didn't know where I was going to come down on this. But as I read both sides of it and listened to these men in these debates, it didn't take me very long to see where the truth was. And I made up my mind where I was going to have to stand, whatever it cost. And I want to tell you, there was a cost involved to gospel preachers. I had some meetings canceled. I had some letters from churches where I'd been before in meetings sending me a questionnaire, wanted to know what my position was about this. And when I answered their question, they didn't want me to come anymore, so I didn't get to go. And that happened to a number of preachers, and I was a young preacher, and there were some men a lot older than I was whose popularity greatly suffered as a result of all of that. And for the benefit of those of you who think that this whole controversy could have been averted if brethren had just been kind and sweet to each other, let me just dispel that rumor. Let me tell you something. It was not a fun time. It was a critical time. There were tears shed, and hearts were broken. There were brethren who had been lifelong companions and friends and worked together in the cause of the Lord that sat at opposite tables during these debates. I had relatives who came down on the other side of these things. They weren't very kind in some of the things they said about me. As a result of all of that, they're developed. Now I'm ashamed to have to tell you this, but they're developed a number of lawsuits over church property. Who's going to get to keep the property? There were brethren who were determined that the anti-element should be prohibited from the use of the property. And that took place in a number of places. I sat through one 4-day court trial in Jackson, Tennessee, over church property at Spring Creek, Tennessee. It was a spectacle. It was terrible to have to live through that. It was, if you think that was a fun time, it was not. It was a terrible time. One congregation in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the brethren who was trying to stand for the truth the best he could was in the pulpit, and some fellow came in the pulpit and literally tore his coat off of his back. Another gospel preacher was there at a meeting one time, and somebody called him into a room down in the basement, said he wanted to talk to him, and he drew a knife on him. And one of the brethren saw what was happening and came and rescued him. There were services that were interrupted with people making noise to try to disrupt and discourage people from hearing what was being said. There was a lot of ungodliness that took place in those days. And I have to tell you this. Out of all of the court trials, I didn't attend all of them. I knew about many that I could get to attend. But of all the trials that I knew about where there was a lawsuit over who got the church property, I do not know of a single one of those that was instituted by the non-institutional brethren. I do not. The lawsuits were instigated and promoted by those who were in promotion of things like the Herald of Truth and the church support of the various institutions. That was a bad time. Division is not pretty. You know, the psalmist said how beautiful it is, 133rd Psalm, how beautiful it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. It is a beautiful thing. There was a time when I was very young, there was a time when you could visit congregations anywhere in this country, and you'd hear about the same kind of preaching. You'd see brethren doing the same thing. That began to change in the late 1940s and early 50s. There began to be some stranger sounds from the pulpit that had been there before. There was a change taking place. The winds of change were blowing at that time. And the sponsoring church was just one symptom of this, the winds of change blowing among the brethren. And so instead of congregations being able to send and support men on their own, they had to find a church, a sponsoring church. In 1957, my wife and I decided to go to Norway and preach the gospel. There were no congregations there. We didn't know a soul there, and we just picked that out and decided that was a place somebody ought to go and preach the gospel. And so we started making our plans to go. I made it clear to the brethren who I had to ask for some support from various congregations. But I made it clear to them that I would not have a sponsoring church, and that they would, if they wanted to support me, they could send their support directly to me, like Philippi did with Paul at Thessalonica, or those churches sent to Paul at Corinth in supporting him. That's the way it's going to be done, or I wasn't going at all. And that's the way it was done. I raised $420 a month. That's the only support we had. Of course, dollars went a little farther back then than they do now. But that was the support we had. There were 12 congregations that helped provide that $420 a month. One sent $10 a month and several sent $50. But that was the way that work was supported over there. There were some who said that if you're going to preach in a foreign country, you can't get it done if you don't have a sponsoring church, because the government will require you to provide documentation as to who's responsible for you when you leave this country and go to another one. That was false. That was not so. I went to Norway. We got the work started. That's what we meant to do. Some other brethren followed me there and worked there for many years in that field. But I want to tell you, you don't have to have a sponsoring church to evangelize. What you need to do is for each congregation to roll up its sleeves and get busy in the community where it is. Contribute your funds and help support men who are able and willing to stand up and preach the truth of the gospel. Do that. God is pleased with that. And you don't have to create some kind of a super organization to do that. The sponsoring church became really a missionary society under the oversight of elders. That's what that really boiled down to ultimately. And so I would encourage the church here at Jamestown, continue doing what you're doing and worshiping according to the pattern of the New Testament. Do everything you can to support those who preach the gospel. Give them encouragement, but don't turn your funds over to some other agency or some other congregation to spend for you. Other churches don't have a right to discipline your members. Other congregations don't have a right to tell you when to meet. Other congregations don't have a right to tell you how to spend your funds. You have a right to choose those to whom you will send your funds, and you can do that yourself. You don't have to send it through some other agency to get that done. That's one of the issues that arose early in the late 1940s and 1950s. And so you asked me to talk about the history of the institutional controversy. That's a part of that history. Now, what are brethren supposed to do about this anyway? Are we to be busy in evangelism? Absolutely. In fact, among the encouraging things that I've seen in the last few years has been the increase in interest on the part of brethren around the country in supporting men to go to other congregations or other countries and preach. There's a lot of that being done now. There's not enough of it being done. There's a lot more that needs to be done. In fact, when I was getting ready to go to Norway, I told brethren that we had 7% of the population of the world in this country, and about 90% of the gospel preaching that was done was being done in this country to 7% of the world's population. I will tell you the odds weren't even, were they? No, and that's one reason, that's one thing that inspired us to want to go and do whatever we could. But there are other men who've done that. And the church at Hebron Lane, where I worship in the Louisville area, for a number of years has spent 80% of its budget every year in evangelism, either supporting men locally or in helping to send it to other parts of the world to preach and spread the gospel of Christ. I'm glad to be a part of that. I'm glad to be a part of that congregation. I commend the brethren there for their willingness and for to support the gospel preaching and for their interest in it and their encouragement of those of us who try to preach it. Now, the sponsoring church, the herald of truth, this was a wedge that helped to divide brethren. And so if you wonder why some churches don't have much to do with other churches, that was one of the reasons for it. Now, since that time, there have been other issues to arise. A number of the churches that followed that trail have their gymnasiums. Some of them are involved in daycare facilities and activities. Some of them are involved in school activities, really. Some of them have gotten involved. Some of them have gone so far now, this is not true of all, but some of them have gone so far now as to have women who are taking part and leading in the public services. And one church that I know of has a woman preacher. She's an assistant. They have two preachers, and she's one of them. And you'd think that would never happen, but it has. And so when you open the gate to do one thing that's unscriptural, it's pretty hard to close it down again. And so you need to be careful about what projects and programs you take on to do. You want to ask, first of all, does it need to be done, and can we do this scripturally? And if you can't do it scripturally, you don't need to do it at all. So may the Lord help you as you continue in your work here at Jamestown to promote the cause of Christ the very best you can. Stand in the gap. Stand up for what's right. Don't be ashamed of it. And recognize the fact that we do have some brethren who have gone far away from where they used to be. I grieve about it. The best friend I ever had as I was growing up as a boy turned out on the other side of the fence, and we drifted apart, and it's been painful to me ever since, even to now. But at any rate, you don't have to hate somebody because you disagree with them. Do you feel bitter toward that? No, I don't feel bitter toward the brethren that disagreed with me over all this and other brethren like me. No, I'm pained about it. I'm not bitter about it at all. I love them, and I still do. I never quit loving them. And I'm sorry that there are some who've come to the place that they can't have that spirit in return, but that's between them and the Lord, and I'll leave that up to Him and to them. But anyway, I appreciate your listening to what I had to say. Now, this afternoon, we're going to talk about the church supporting human organizations, and so come back. We'll talk about that this afternoon. Get your hymn books now, would you please, and turn to the invitation song's been announced. We're going to sing this song not as a matter of routine or ritual, but we sing it as a sincere effort on our part to encourage you to think about your standing before the Lord. If you're not a Christian, you need to be one. Jesus said, except you believe that I am He, you will die in your sins. You don't want to do that. If you believe that He is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and you're sorry for the way you've been living and you're resolved you're going to change that in repentance, then come before us now. Stand up and say, yes, I do believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and today we'll baptize you into Christ for the forgiveness of your sins. If you started serving the Lord and you've fallen by the wayside, you need to come home. We hope and pray today will be the time when you will decide to do that. We're going to stand now and sing. If you need to respond, make your way to one of these aisles and to the front.